Honorable West Bengal Governor Sri M.K. Narayanan, esteemed High Commissioner Sri Biren Nanda, Chairman of AII Mr. Johansson, Director Dr. Amitabh Mattu, Deputy Vice Chancellor of Melbourne University Dr. Elliott, scholars, academics, intellectuals, policymakers, ladies and gentlemen. In celebration of argumentative tradition of India, how exciting and rewarding it is to be indulged in debates and discourses on critical issues pertaining to India's polity, society, economy, and foreign relations. But no doubt, it is a fact which we must also appreciate that in arguing, in discoursing, and in debating, we may not reach a consensus. We may not reach a consensus, not our divergence may disappear. I think this is the beauty of an argumentative Indian. After all, truth itself has many hues, many interpretations, and many sides. Thanks to the Australia-India Institute and its director Amitabh Mattu to provide a forum to the argumentative, if not garrulous Indians, for 2 days, including today, to argue over critical issues now affecting India's democracy, policy, economy, and foreign relations. Ladies and gentlemen, in continuation, today we have with us Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who will argue out the case before us, the burden of democracy, India after 65 years. One side of the story of Indian democracy, as you are aware, is extremely positive, making us arguing out that the Indian democracy is complacent. Means we are complacent about Indian democracy because it has efficacy and it is very much effective. But the other side of the argument is also there. Democracy in India has failed, and its failings are obstacle to the growth of India. Pratap is going to tell us about all these things. Pratap is presently the president of the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi, educated at Oxford and Princeton. He has won many laurels to his credit, including the 2011 prestigious Infosys Prize for Social Sciences. Pratap is also a leading public intellectual of India whose columns frequently appear in leading national and international dailies. He has many important publications, including The Burden of Democracy that came out in 2003 under Penguin India. I'm not sure if Pratap's today's talk has any thematic link with this book. If I have correctly understood the book, Pratap, you have talked there about restoring the sense of moral well-being and responsibility at the core of the democratic challenge before India. I hope you will touch upon various challenges faced by Indian democracy now and discourse on how successfully to overcome these challenges. Pratap, the floor is open for you.
Thank you for that generous introduction, and thank you in particular to Amitabh and his team for giving this really unique opportunity. It's also a bit intimidating speaking to this audience. I mean, I think friends from whom I've learned so much, so many interesting policymakers and so forth, and to try and lecture to this group about democracy seems a little bit superfluous. What I thought I'd do in the next sort of 20, 25 minutes, and please warn me if I'm going over, is perhaps take stock of where we are at this particular historical juncture in the evolution of Indian democracy. I mean, one way of doing this talk would have been to kind of do a sort of overview with lots and lots of sort of data about achievements, failures, limitations, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But there is something particularly interesting about this moment, and I think it might also serve as a kind of bridge between the discussion we had yesterday and I think the one we are likely to have in the other panels today. I was describing what I was going to do to somebody, and they said, well, maybe, you know, Kiran Bedi talked about the optimism of the will, you can talk about the pessimism of the intellect when it comes to democracy. Now, the title, The Burden of Democracy, refers to an essay I wrote in 2003, an essay masquerading as a book, which had really two themes, which I think actually, in some senses, do capture something of importance that is going on. The first theme was, in a sense, the critical question of how do inherited forms of social inequality disfigure the experience of democracy? And the particularly uncomfortable fact that almost all democracies in the world have had to face, which is most democracies have a kind of original sin. You know, you think of United States and you think of race as the original sin. In India, caste is the original sin. And that original sin keeps recurring back in different guises despite profound economic and social changes. And in a sense, the inabilities of democracies to adequately compensate for the mutilations and disfigurements that those forms of social inequalities produce in their workings. And the second related theme, which is related, but you can think about it analytically distinctly, was this whole question of how is the power of the state organized in a democracy, such that it consistently produces a gap between representation and responsiveness. So Indian democracy is deeply representative, deeply contested, deeply vibrant. Yet at the same time, there is this persistent sense that it does not produce a government that's responsive enough. There's a gap between representation and legitimacy. I mean, legitimacy understood in a normative sense, where legitimacy does not simply refer to practices of popular authorization. It refers to the idea that do people who live under these policies, would they freely accept those policies as, in a sense, being the right one? So the accountability challenge, in a sense, is to try and explain what explains this persistent gap between representation and responsiveness. And in some senses, those themes are perhaps central to this contemporary moment in some ways. Perhaps the accountability theme gets a lot more visibility than, in a sense, the equality theme. So what I'll sort of try and do is kind of present a story where I'm, at one level, actually a lot more hopeful about what's going on in India. That the underlying trends suggest that India is in the midst of a great churning, with possibilities of a really tectonic shift in the mode of governance. I say possibility, nothing is certain, nothing certain in politics, and a lot will depend on sort of, you know, what we actually do about this opportunity. But I think it is important to focus on that big picture if we are not to miss the woods for the trees. So just to sort of, you know, we all love democracy, at least I do, and I think most of these people do. And there is a kind of romance to democracy. There's a poetry to democracy. I think Gopal Gandhi will probably talk about it at some point. And my favorite description of democracy is still from Plato's Republic, who was no Democrat. But, you know, this idea of a multicolored cloak embroidered with every ornament, where every kind of being can find their place, a constitution of many constitutions. I mean, there's just no better description of democracy than this, right? But there is the romance of democracy, and then there's the plumbing of democracy. And unfortunately, the plumbing of democracy, if you look at the comparative context, I think looks something like this. One of the most astonishing facts about democracy and the history of democracy globally, this is not a particularly Indian challenge, is democracy has turned out to be a relatively conservative form of government. In the 19th century, if you had asked people, you know, for and against democracy, most arguments about democracy were, if you give the poor people the vote, they'll vote out the rich. right? That was the kind of standard, I mean, a caricatured argument about democracy, right? Absolutely nowhere in this world, the world did it happen. Democracies have proved quite compatible, if you look at all the comparative data, with deep, persistent economic and social inequalities. Remember, Adam Smith had prophesied that it is a democracy, the United States, that will be the last to abolish slavery, right? Okay. The stigma of race was very difficult to overcome in the United States. And I think this is a fact that does require some deep explanation. And I think both John Dunn and Adam Jaworski, who's probably the leading empirical political scientist on the relationship between democracy and equality, I think the summary, in a sense, captures that democracy has proved extraordinarily. And one of the reasons I think elites sign on to democracy, actually, part of the attraction was when they discovered that it wasn't a threat to their power, that you could actually enlist and, as it were, divert democracy's energies in ways in which actually led to greater stability for elite power. So I think it is worth, I think, sort of reminding ourselves of, I think, this challenge that democracy faces. Now to the current moment. I'm going to return to that challenge towards the end. I began by saying that India is at the verge of a kind of tectonic shift. And I'm going to use a very stylized, to use Weber terms, a kind of ideal type characterization of that shift. The reality is messy, but hopefully it'll, heuristically help us see what is special about this moment, right? Now, one way of characterizing this shift is in the following terms. The Indian state, not just the Indian state, I think every single country that I know of has gone through a transition of this kind. When you read accounts of corruption in India, India looks like United States in the 1890s, 1910s. I mean, it's roughly the same per capita income. A novel from Trollope or Fitzgerald could easily describe, in a sense, this reality. Kickbacks, infrastructure contracts, corruption in local government. We forget wads of cash used to be, distributed around the US Senate as late as the 1950s, right? Possible exception of Bismarck in Germany, no society that we know of has experienced high rates of growth for a decade or so without massive corruption accompanying it. Not a single one. Victorian Britain, United States, even Australia, dare one say. China, certainly. The problem of corruption turns out to be much more sticky. We often talk about speedy punishments. China executes more people for corruption. About 1 in every 6 mayor has been executed for corruption in the last 10 years. Absolutely no dent in the scale of corruption, although the structure of corruption is different. And I think for development purposes, the structure of corruption matters perhaps more than the scale of corruption. So I think we need to sort of take a slightly sober breath about. I mean, this is not to kind of be defensive about Indian democracy and saying we shouldn't do anything about corruption. But I think it does push us to really think harder about what is actually going on, right? Is it amenable to sort of simple institutional solutions, or do we have to think much harder about the ways in which our institutions are actually embedded in wider social practices? Now, one way of characterizing the contemporary moment, and you might think of this as kind of, Hegel's spirit of the age working through sort of Arvind Kejriwal and Kiran Bedi and Anurag Roy and all the kind of civil society activism in India, is the following. The Indian state up till now was sort of characterized by, if you like, sort of 5 principles. I mean, there are lots of things up on the board. I want to talk about 5. Principle of vertical accountability. So if you are in the state, who are you accountable to? Somebody higher up than you, right? Bureaucrats answer to ministers and so forth. I'm putting it very crudely. Relative secrecy, right? And by secrecy, I don't mean just sort of information about files and decisions, but there was a relative asymmetry of information between state and civil society, right? Incredible centralization, which many people talked about yesterday. Scarcity of the state. In comparison to the demands on the Indian state is actually a very small state, right? How many town planners do you think India has? India doesn't have enough statisticians in NSSO, right, to chart what's going on, right? Judges per million of population, police, I mean, on every measure of stateness, the sheer availability of state is a very scarce resource, right? And the last thing, which is sort of not in the red here, but I'll put it out as well, wide discretion. That the mode in which the state governed was the exercise of discretionary powers on a massive scale, right? Now, what has happened, and I think this is the good news of the last 4, 5, 7 years, it's been a slow process, but I think it's coming to a boil, is that these principles of governance have basically broken down. Which is to say that we have reached a point that if the ruling class thinks, or if the Indian state thinks that it can function on the premise of simple vertical accountability rather than horizontal accountability, right? Where anybody, other institutions within the government, citizens, all kinds of people, media can ask questions. It's living in a fool's paradise. Secrecy. We have talked about the Right to Information Act, as an enabling tool. But I mean secrecy also in a wider sense. 20 years ago, if the government didn't tell you your water was poisoned, there was nobody else to tell you that your water was poisoned. Now civil society will be out there in 2 minutes, right? The relative asymmetry of information between state and civil society is dramatically shifted, right? Centralization is leading to a little bit of a clamor for kind of participatory, more inclusive governance. Right? State scarcity. Now, at one level, governance will be a scarce resource in India for a very long time. But one thing growth has done is allowed the possibility of increase in state presence in a way that is unprecedented. So Bihar, I mean, just to take random figures, Bihar has given out more road contracts, hired more teachers in the last 7 years than it had in the previous 50, 60 years together. 10 years ago, a 4,000 crore scheme was a big scheme. Now we talk 100,000 crores, right? The scale of the state, and scale makes a huge difference. It makes a difference to politics, actually. One of the interesting things you're beginning to see in different states, 10 years ago, and it's an interesting political fact, India had one of the highest anti-incumbency rates in any democracy in the world. Right? If you were a state government, your chances of getting elected for 2 successive terms were very low. Right? So I actually don't quite buy this idea that it's all clientelistic politics and the state could buy voters off. Right? India's anti-incumbency record doesn't bear that out. But part of the challenge of a state government was that even if you were a well-functioning state government, the incremental difference you made in a 5-year term was relatively small. You know, if you gave out 600 kilometers of road contracts because the state didn't have any money, what's the marginal increment? As opposed to giving out, let's say, 15,000 kilometers worth of road contracts, right? So the scale of the state is massively transforming our politics in both good and bad ways. It creates more opportunities for rent seeking, which is the story you're hearing, but it also creates opportunities for a different kind of welfare effect, of the kind that you did not have. And I think in a lot, Dr. Jadhav will probably talk about this. In our planning process, you're beginning to see those scale effects. Whether they'll be implemented or not is a different level, different question. And discretion. Now, there is an illusion among civil society activists sometimes that you can replace discretion by rules. In a way, I think that's a little bit illusory because you need discretion because otherwise governments could be run by robots, right? I mean, government power inherently requires taking decisions based on. But what is changing is the demand for how you justify the exercise of that discretionary power is certainly changing. And I think one of the reasons the state is in so much trouble is that its internal practices are not geared to, as it were, facing the burdens of public justification. Right? Now, the exciting thing, as I said, about India is that these 5 principles on the left-hand side, they have more or less collapsed for good. I don't think we can now reconstruct our state and the authority of the state based on an institutional design that was premised on these principles. And this is a huge revolution. Now, what replaces it, I think, is still very much an open question. Right? The 3 other things that have changed, right, and I'm just going to sort of quickly talk about them, is the nature and character of political problems that we face. and economic problems are also changing partly as a result of the growth process. One famous politician once said that, even as late as the 1960s, as Shankar Ayer was talking about, right? When you were doing anti-poverty, what it meant was preventing famine. You did a good job if you sort of prevented famine, and we prided ourselves on that, right? Now the clamor for participation in the economy, right, is of a very different order of magnitude. You have to move from famine prevention to actually addressing nutrition problems, right, just to take that one example. I'm going to give a couple of, in a sense, other examples. But one of the things that is happening is once you move from survival problems to what I, in a sense, call wicked problems. And the wicked problems, I'm thinking of things like water management systems, urbanization. They are wicked problems in a very specific technical sense. Actually, there's a lot of good work in Australia on this, which is your objective is clear when you define a wicked problem. We want adequate water supply. We want urbanization. But how you characterize what the means to getting to that system is has these features. There's lack of a definitive formulation. There's existence of possible multiple solutions. It could be public, it could be private, it could be, long distance carrying of water, it could be short groundwater. There's an absence of a test to decide the optimal value of a response, right? Each decision that you make in creating that system is very path dependent. So think of healthcare systems, right? It's taken the US 50 years to move its healthcare system slightly, right? Because once you create a system of that scale, it entrenches a political economy of its own, which is very hard to move around, right? And because the scale is so large, right? Once you have put in that scale of investment, it's very hard to reflexively correct. So let us say you're doing urbanization, and you create a particular pattern of spatial planning, right? Suburban US or whatever, densification or whatever. Once you have that built up physical capital, it's very hard to move it around for 20, 35 years, right? Now, almost all the challenges we are facing in negotiating public policy, or many of them, have this character that they're wicked problems in this sense. Now, wicked problems pose a particular kind of challenge to the idea of public reason, which the Vice Chancellor talked about very eloquently in the context of toleration. But public reason is also about another thing. It's an attempt to come to mutually acceptable agreements, right? On large-scale design, and healthcare, for example. The 12th plan has a particular architecture for healthcare. You could argue for it, you could argue against it. One of the weaknesses of our democracy, we focus a lot on the corruption story, which is there, and I don't want to belabor that, is what is the form of negotiation that a democracy needs to undertake to build consensus on how you tackle wicked problems of this kind, right? That, I suspect, is actually going to be a harder challenge for the exercise of public reason. And you can take any issue, environmental design, the optimal growth, balance between growth and development. Somewhere they run up against this intellectual problem of two positions, each with their own internal integrity, right? Colliding headlong against each other with no way of, in a sense, kind of resolving that dispute. What you end up, therefore, doing often in public policy is actually a kind of compromise. And sometimes compromise is a bad thing. If you have two options, A and B, it's better to do A or B well than to do something that is neither A or nor B. And I suspect with a lot of our designs, whether we are doing urbanization, whether we are doing health, whether we are doing education, have that character of, as it were, an unreasoned compromise, right? Rather than, in a sense, working through wicked problems. What compounds the challenge of wicked problems in India, particularly, is, I think, something that was persistent yesterday in yesterday's discussion, was this question of trust in the state. So it might be possible, for example, to abstractly come to some consensus about optimal design. Maybe you might say cash transfers or whatever, right? But because of that backlog of state failure, right, most citizens do not have at the moment reason to trust the state to be able to deliver on those promises, which is another hugely complicated question. Now, the problem about trusting the state, and this is an interesting thing, trust is one of the things you either presumptively have it or you don't, right? But trust is not something you can build incrementally. I mean, you can't build a state in sort of 2 leaps, right? As it were. So we are at this moment where I said the old order of governance has collapsed, and good, wonderful. This is civil society's great achievement. But the negotiation around what form public reason will take, how do you move from a system of deals to a system of rules, right? How do you create democratic spaces for public distribution? That, I think, churning is, in a sense, still going on. Now, the other 2 things I mentioned, which I just want to briefly sort of end with, is particularly one thing. The move from what I call simple identity to complex identity. And again, this is very stylized oversimplification. Identities are never simple in any society, as anthropologists will tell us. But in some ways, if you think of, let's say, the class structure of India, right, 20, 25 years ago, or the caste structure. I mean, caste structure sort of remains the same in terms of the enumeration of castes. But the class structure, when we used to do political economy, was relatively simple. There's landless agricultural labor, there's small farmers, there's large farmers, there's big industry, and there's bureaucrats or something, right? One of the things growth has done is actually made this class structure a bit more complicated. So if you actually see new data, for example, I mean, Ajay Shah has actually been making this claim very recently, actually, that the share of employment in agriculture has actually dramatically fallen, right? But the fact that you have hybrid employment, right? So landless agriculture labor plus taxi driver in the same family. What profession or caste or class does that make them, right? It's interestingly captured. I mean, I'm just throwing this out, not that I believe this data, but I think it's an interesting factoid. This was a recent survey done on which class do people identify themselves in, right? So do people call themselves middle class, upper class, right? Here are the numbers for India and the US, right? So 4.6% of Indians identify themselves as upper class. US, it's only 1%, right? It's the 1 in 99% story. But look at the numbers for the middle class, right? Upper middle class, lower middle class. I mean, in India, that's almost kind of 50%, almost sort of, in a sense, equivalent to the US, right? Now, we can, debate what this means, but this fact of self-identification is itself an interesting fact. And at one level, it's actually borne down by other numbers. If you look at the size of the middle class, there's a global middle class at over $10 purchasing power a day, which is relatively small. But if you define middle class as, in a sense, the distribution around the median income, right, or sort of not less than 80% of the median income, and not more than 200% of the median income, about 50% of India actually does fall in that sort of, in the sense, middle class category. But the point about middle class is not, in a sense, the descriptive professional category or the functional category. It really is a signal about the aspiration to participate in the economy in a very different kind of way than the old economy of scarcity where, if you're a landless agricultural labor, you're destined to be landless agricultural labor and so forth. And this poses enormous problems for actually how do you create winning economic coalitions. I think we are seeing this puzzle around inflation, for example. I mean, the old shibboleth that, inflation was the death nail in politics is gone. But partly that's gone because rural identities have become a lot more complex. If you get, on the consumption side, you're doing well, right? You can compensate for that by, in a sense, keeping MSP down. I mean, there are all kinds of plays you can do with economic policy that you could not do in the old system. Now, I just want to 3 little factoids about this middle class and then end with a thought about how this might affect our politics. So, 3 little facts. The first is, this is NSS data on transport. The computer figures are a bit off for this census. The global middle class, this is a category created by my colleague Partha Mukhopadhyay, is really, as I said, Nancy Birdsall's category of purchasing power of more than $10 PPP a day. The local middle class is this median one I'm talking about. Look at the depth of consumption in the deciles, right? Refrigerators actually go pretty, at least I was surprised how far down they go, right? Interestingly, motorcycles, right? So, including in almost the bottom decile, you're actually getting 2%, but if you look at the fourth decile from the bottom, it's 20%, right? Two things interesting about this. I mean, just as one, of course, is the kind of the depth of consumption, which in a sense transforms the character of how economic policy affects you. The other interesting thing, why the motorcycle figure worries me, is not because it's an expression necessarily of greater consumer. It's an expression of the fact that you have no public transport, right? So your only means of participation is creating your private transport, right? Second story, this is a really interesting, this is education completion rates by age cohort, right? So on the last is the age cohort that's currently 22, 24 years age. Two things that will strike you about this. The most amazing thing is almost all the gains in secondary education in urban India have come from increased female enrollment. It's an absolutely striking fact, right? And it's interesting for all kinds of reasons. One, there's this puzzle about why that male 56% enrollment rate has not moved up much more, or has been pretty flat for about 10 years. There's the other interesting fact. If you ask the question, where is India's talented workforce? Here's part of your answer. Your universities are producing them, they're not coming on the job market, right? I mean, it's really so that gap between your educational attainment and the transition to the workforce in urban India, it's also a harbinger, by the way, of an astonishing social change in the making, right? If you think about India's record on female infanticide, sex ratios, but on the other hand, look at the story. Same is, by the way, of rural, right? Where male enrollment has remained more or less flat for about 10 years. But the gains in female enrollment are absolutely astonishing. But what's interesting about the education story, now look at the proportion of students enrolled in private schools. By decile classes, one of the footnotes, but the upper one is urban India, the one is rural India. And you just look at the steep upward curve on enrollment in private institutions, crossing more than 60% in urban India, right? The third vignette I sort of want to kind of, the healthcare slide is missing, is private consumption of healthcare. Now, what's common in all these three stories, apart from the interesting micro stories in education health, which we can talk about, is this is a middle class being formed largely by private access to public goods, right? So it's providing for its own education, increasingly. It provides for almost all of its own healthcare. 90% of spending is out of pocket. It provides for its own transport. It's now providing for its own security. Often, security guards are the largest sort of industry. Now, this is an unprecedented range of numbers in the formation of any middle class in any developing country I know. You cannot think of a comparable middle class, even in a country like Chile, which had the most developed private education system, right? Where, in a sense, the middle class secedes from the state system, right? I mean, this is a literal secession in some ways. And so the interesting question is, while you have this tectonic shift going on about, dissolving the old order of the state, right, which the middle class is very successful at the same time, you have this incredible battle between voice and exit, right? To take Hirschman's sort of, categories, you can change the system by sort of participation in creating voice, or you change the system simply by exiting, right? In fact, the exodus to Australia is another example of that exit, literal exit, right? Not just of Indian capital, but also of Indian students because Indian higher education can't provide, right? Now, I don't know how this is going to work out, but in comparative historical terms, when you look at Brazil, when you look at the rise of European middle classes, when you look at the rise of the US, any middle class, the degree of exit of the Indian middle class from public systems, in this sense, right, is absolutely unprecedented, right? And so the question, as we know from old literature, right, schemes for the poor are always poor schemes, right? I mean, sort of adage in almost all the literature on welfare politics, right? If this middle class secession continues from the state, will it actually counteract the effects of this civil society mobilization we are saying? Basically, people stop caring about public schools, right? We've given up on public universities, frankly, right? Because the most dominant classes have, in a sense, seceded from that system, right? So how is this dialectic between exit and voice actually going to, in a sense, play out? The second aspect of this middle class story, which I want to point, is, as everybody knows, in a sense, India is still largely an informal economy, at least in sort of informal terms. The way we characterize these is complicated. Now, the way I think about informality, right, is, we can talk about the legal definition of what's formal and informal. Is one thing informality has allowed Indians so far is participation in the economy and politics at any price point, right? And by that, I mean, in a sense, so think of, let's say, if you want to buy an air conditioner in India, you can get the 5-star LG, Samsung manufacturer, or you can get something that's put together in Dharavi in the backyard, right? You want to buy clothes, you can get the local tailor, right? Now, what happens partly as a result of the form of our urbanization, right, is that in the process of formalization, it's possible that you can actually raise the price points at which you enter the economy. And I think the key example of this is the form of our urbanization. So everybody says India is not like China. India can't do things China does, right? 600,000 people were evicted from Delhi in the last 7 years, okay? More than 500,000 people during the Commonwealth Games. Don't tell me India doesn't do China. When Calcutta wanted to clean up Garihart, right, it did it, right? Now, the question that arises is, if your urban spaces, which I think are important for all the reasons that I talked about, the consumption story, the education story, the mobility story, right? If they are going to raise the price points at which poor people can participate and access cities, right, in the design and architecture of the cities, I think you're going to have, in a way, a serious problem. One of the reasons reform doesn't have as much legitimacy in India is that most of Indian reform has been reform for the big corporate sector. Again, by means of exit. Most of them can have captive power plants. They can hedge against foreign exchange fluctuations by borrowing abroad, right? Most of them have cornered the credit of public sector banks. I mean, the degree of credit concentration in India is unprecedented, right? Who has liberalization not happened for? The hawker who wants to come to the city and set up a trade, right? The street side road stall, right? Those low-cost entry points that allowed you to participate in this story are actually becoming, in a sense, harder to come by, right? And the interesting question is, in a sense, whether part of the secession of that middle class that I talked about from, in a sense, the public system, is not only going to produce a downward spiral of accountability, right, where you don't have an investment in making the state, in some ways, and vitiates the politics of accountability. It also creates a spatial dualism in the Indian economy, right, where the one message the poor get is, yes, they can have education, the state can do all kinds of schemes for them, but the one thing we don't want them to do is, in a sense, share this social sort of space with us. Last and final issue on the middle class, and this I've been worrying about a lot. There's this old book by G.M. Young, The Ideology of Meritocracy, right? And Young made this actually really persuasive argument that middle classes that think that what they are earning is a consequence of their merit. And this is ingrained in the education system, right? Because part of what defines the self-identity of middle class is the fact that it has educational capital, right? Right? Also have a greater sense of entitlement to what they earn. You can shame an aristocracy, you can never shame a meritocracy. Okay? Global rule of sort of redistributive politics, right? If the self-identification of this middle class becomes one, exit from the public system, we've done what we've done on the dint of our own efforts, right? How much will its commitment to creating a society based on reciprocity actually remain? You could actually make the argument, I think even actually in the US in the 1990s, this paradoxical shift as American universities became more meritocratic in some ways, right? Right? The sense of entitlement of their graduates about what salaries they were entitled to also correspondingly shifted, right? And I think you're going to see this cultural play. So, I don't have time to go into the law and this vignette I'll sort of leave you with. So you are seeing a society undergoing this massive structural transformation in the state, a massive transformation in a sense in the underlying social dynamics, right? What you need in this context is a political class that is able to carry out this transition in a negotiated, orderly fashion, right? The challenge for us is the fact that, in a sense, our politicians are becoming more and more disembedded from that function of social mediation, which is something they used to be very good at, right? We are just doing a study on sort of who are the new corporators in urban India. So who runs for, Mumbai government, Hyderabad, just as a, these are your future politicians, you're kind of, 70% of them are contractors, right? The unavailability of politicians, there are a few exceptions to this, and I'll just kind of mention, who are socially embedded enough on the one hand, right, to have the confidence and inspire trust in their constituents, but can connect up to these larger conversations around these wicked problems. That political class is in a sense kind of not there. You actually don't, and you in a sense see it diminishing. In fact, now the only exceptions to this are some strong state leaders. But what characterizes their form of social embeddedness is actually just straightforward presidentialist system at the state level. What's common to all our successful chief ministers? They completely bypass their party, right? In fact, they're successful because they've shut out their party, right? Right? They absolutely managed to insulate the bureaucracy for a while from the political process. You can do that for 1 term, 2 terms. It's not a sustainable model of running a democratic society. They all centralize power, right? None of the successful chief ministers has been a radical decentralizer of power, right? So you can get good short-term gains from that, but it does poses a structural challenge about how it is that this form of centralization is going to feed into this larger change that is happening, in a sense, under the surface. So the argument I, in a sense, would sort of end it with that I think India is at this very exciting moment where you need 2 processes to happen simultaneously. The first is what you might call the liberal critique of oligarchy, which I think you're seeing a bit more of, which is that there are concentrations of power, particularly in the nexus between business and state, which you need to critique from a liberal point of view. Right? I mean, we often forget, the biggest critic of state-business relations was Adam Smith, right? Liberals should hate concentrations of power no matter where they are, right? But the second thing you need is, in a sense, the social democratic critique of populism, right? Which says, look, there's an unprecedented opportunity in terms of state resources that we have, but they need to be directed in ways that are actually participatory, both in the sense of the process by which those are allocated, but also in the form in which they enable further participation in the economy, right? I think we are getting a little bit of the liberal critique of the oligarchy. We are not getting the social democratic critique of populism just yet. I'll end there.
I think we have now 10 minutes. The microphone is there, I think it's circulating. It can start with you. Yeah. Please identify yourself.
Sadanand.
Yeah, just you can introduce and.
Not sure, is this on? Sadanand Dhume, thank you, Pratap, for that wonderful lecture. My question, as you get mic'd up, if you're mic'd, is that when you look at this new middle class and you look at the current constellation of India's political parties, is there something about some of these parties that makes them more likely to adapt and respond to these very dramatic changes than others, or are they all roughly in the same position? And if some are more likely to respond, what characteristics would you see in them that would allow them to do that?
Okay, it's a great question, and it actually allows me to say something I actually missed on the slide, which is the term progressivism up there. I was actually recently in Brazil, and it's interesting if you look at Brazil, and they had a similar kind of anti-corruption movement, right? And there have been far-reaching changes as a result of that movement. Lula's close associates were just sort of sent to 3 years prison, right? Or if you look at the United States in the 1910s, 1920s, right, the rise of sort of progressivism in some ways, right? A couple of things are very striking which you don't see in India yet. One is some party in the political establishment appropriating the anti-corruption movement, right? It's harder to do that in India for all existing political parties, partly because they're all implicated in the old order, right? So at the moment, we are at that moment of immense defensiveness, which is why this argument is kind of so testy. I mean, look, right? In the US, what helped? In the Brazil, what helped was the fact that you got a natural opening at the top, right? So because you had a term limit, a new president, Dilma could sort of run on an anti-corruption plank against Lula, right? In India, the top of the political party system is actually a very close deal for all kinds of reasons. I mean, it's the amount of collective action it'll take to overcome them. It's not an accident in the US. The other major reform was the creation of intra-party democracy, to a certain degree, right? The creation of systems of primary. So I don't think the issue is which class is more middle class oriented or less middle class oriented. The issue is which political party will be able to embrace this agenda of internal institutional change, which can then allow all these new elements to be incorporated within the party. Right? One of the reasons we forget you got the fragmentation of the party system was because Indian party systems were closed, right? If I'm a newly emerging social group and I say, should I orient Congress towards my view by joining it, campaigning within Congress, or should I form a new political party? The first route is simply not open. Or let's put it this way, I'm not sure what the rules of the game in that party are going to be, right? By which I get to orient that party to a particular view or to a particular set of people. Everywhere that the anti-corruption reform movement has been accompanied by massive changes in the internal functioning of parties. And I think the interesting question is which leadership will be able to make that far-reaching change. It may or may not bring electoral dividends. I mean, those are the kinds of things you don't normally see. But I think that's, the question to ask.
And do you have an answer?
Sorry?
Do you have an answer which party?
That's where politics is always contingent. I mean, I actually firmly believe politics by its nature is contingent. I mean, I don't think there's a structural answer. I think Congress is going to find it slightly harder to do for, given the way the party is structured. But I don't see any party leadership at the moment having that imagination to be able to project that change.
Bob Smith, a retired public servant and academic. Thank you for your lecture. I was very interested in the implications for the civil service, its scope, its role, how it's managed, and particularly how it connects with the different varieties of politicians you've described. Are there 2 or 3 pithy things you can say about what the civil service should do and who's likely to do to make the reforms internally that are needed? Thank you.
Well, it's a very big question, and Mr. Barrett can probably answer it better. I'll just say one thing about the civil service thing. I mean, the relationship between the civil servant and politicians has become very complicated, particularly at the state level. To me, the biggest worry about the Indian civil service, I think two things. One is the fact that there is actually a form of internal class warfare within the Indian civil service, which we don't openly talk about. If you take the Indian police service, right, for example, one of the only police forces in the world, right, where the officer cadre is selected by the same exam as you're selecting foreign service officers and others, but where the constable has absolutely no hope of making it, let's say, to, head Mumbai police, right? I mean, which is typically what would happen in New York or elsewhere, right? That internal social stratification in the civil service, right, is one of the reasons that the command structure of the civil service has actually broken down quite significantly. The most disempowered people in a lot of government departments are now the secretaries. I mean, there's a lot of empirical evidence, right? But if you go to places like the police and so forth, it's even more apparent. The second part that the civil service has never adjusted to. I'm a big votary of decentralization. It's a complicated thing, but there's no way you can govern a country like India with the allocation of powers at different levels of government that we have at the moment. There is very little bureaucratic support for decentralization. Political support is tepid for various reasons we can go into. But unless you have a civil service commitment to radically transform the relationship between that bureaucracy and lower levels of government, you're actually not going to get genuine decentralization. So I think those are the two, for me, the bigger structural things. I mean, there are lots of other things about recruitment, promotions we can talk about later.
Raj Kumar, Vice Chancellor of Jindal Global University. Pratap, from the standpoint of the theme of burden of democracy, I would like you to reflect upon the role of judiciary. The reason this question has become far more important in India is that every major policy issue, including major reforms, have been subjected to a far greater both constitutional and legislative scrutiny. And the judiciary has been interpreting these aspects in its own manner, and that has indeed driven a lot of policies. And connected to that is the question of rule of law, where increasingly, even in the context of anti-corruption movement, we see a response in the form of people being arrested and probably temporarily sent till the trial process on. That itself is being considered as a victory by, in many ways, the citizenry. So there is a very strange framework on the basis of which rule of law is being attempted to, while we know for sure that this is not the way we can establish a rule of law society. So these two aspects, I believe, are going to significantly impact the future framework of Indian democracy. It will be useful if you can reflect on it.
You know my views in the judiciary. So look, as one element in producing a new form of horizontal accountability, the judiciary is very important. People will now begin to say, look, I may have at some point to answer this question in court, right? And that's a huge achievement, right? And in that sense, the judiciary has catalyzed, right, a different kind of response. And I don't think you'll see the response in convictions now. But think of a civil servant taking decisions now and saying, it's not enough for me to be able to say I satisfied A, B, and C. Tomorrow, I'm going to be hauled up in court and I'll have to explain myself there, right?
So in that sense, it's a catalyst for change. But your larger point, which I agree with, which is, I don't think what the judiciary has been doing in India is rule of law in the classic sense at all. It's not rule of law in the sense that it doesn't have the classic characteristics of publicity, public reason, generality, non-arbitrariness in some senses. It's been a form of expressive palliative justice. Oh my God, people are getting angry over corruption. Let's put this guy in jail for 6 months, give him bail later, not put 5 other guys in jail. Some of those cases I've actually looked at very closely, at least all the documentary evidence that's produced. And I don't want to second guess the courts. But the internal inconsistency in what the judiciary is doing, that itself is enough to vitiate the rule of law aspect. But you know, there's an interesting question about the authority of judiciary in a complex society like India's. I mean, my argument has been that part of the reason judiciary carries authority is precisely because of this feature. It gives every part of the system enough reason to play the judicial game, right? And part of the way it gives them that reason is precisely providing these modus vivendi rather than deciding principles on first principles. If it actually were more successful at that, you would probably get a bigger political backlash against the judiciary. So it's actually toward this quite fine line between being a conduit of public anger without actually precipitating a crisis of relationship between the judiciary and the executive branch.
Rohini Somanathan. Pratap, you said 3 very interesting things. You connected them, and I wanted to connect them in a slightly different way. One was the middle class exit. The other was really this gap between representation and responsiveness. And the third was chief ministers going out on their own. And I think Bihar is a really interesting case because, in a sense, it allows us to connect these 3 things. One of the things that you, of course, know, but might add to this discussion is really that the private schools that we're talking about are really bad private schools. Yeah. And the salaries that these private schools pay are very, very low compared to government salaries to private school teachers. So that's one thing. Yeah. If you look at households that are actually sending their kids to these schools, they're sending them, of course, because they're better than what they're getting in the government system, but they're splitting it. I mean, so they're really credit constrained. They're not middle class who've opted for private. They're right. Sort of, optimizing, often sending girls if they get to high school to private. Yeah. Nitish Kumar, when he came in, distanced himself from his party, and we actually didn't know if he would survive or not. Yeah. Now that's completely changed. In some sense, he has a lot more support within his party than he did before, simply because citizenry has responded. So this then brings us back to the third point, which is really, can't this gap between responsiveness and representation really be bridged if we use the scale of public spending in sensible ways? And I think Bihar has shown that we can do that. And can we do that more generally? And your thoughts on that?
You want to comment? Or do you want to collect a couple? No, actually, I mean, I agree with you. In fact, I didn't go into sort of the scale argument as much because one of the things that scale does, right, is it allows, if done well and done quickly in exemplary ways, the creation of a source of legitimacy that you didn't have access to till recently. You can sort of bypass these intermediary structures, right? And a lot of chief ministers are actually doing just that. In particular sectors, some more than in others. And I think that story, so when we talk about the corruption story, if you actually did an aggregate story about how many services are more corrupt that citizens access and how many less, it's actually a much more mixed and encouraging story than the story we hear from kind of the high corruption end of the story, right? And you have chief ministers who've done interesting combinations, incredibly good incredibly ingenious high corruption with incredibly efficient use of scale of state to deliver some basic services. In fact, Tamil Nadu is actually a very good example of that, where just on the structure of corruption story, if you look at the US story, part of the transition was when corruption got concentrated in 4 or 5 sectors, right? Real estate, infrastructure contracts, natural resources, right? It actually allowed politicians to collect their rents from those sectors, right? And yet in a sense, exempt other kinds of things, right? Food stamps, in India it will be PDS, in Tamil Nadu, midday meal schemes, from that kind of corruption. In fact, the irony of India has been that typically the poorer the state, the more likely the schemes for the poor will be scammed, right? And part of this, because that was the only rent game in town, right? So in a way, the shift to big corruption, I think you're beginning to see elements of it even in Haryana, actually, a state like Haryana, where, you get certain services being exempted. So I think your point is that the counter to what you're saying in the case of Bihar is the following, which is it's worked for some good low-hanging fruit. So, you get a lot of teachers in, you do a lot of interesting experimentation on social expenditure. Has it brought Nitish Kumar enough legitimacy to do the kinds of complex negotiations that the next stage of Bihar's transition will require, right? Urban reconfiguration, industrialization, right? I think the jury is still out on that one. But I think what he has shown is if you use scale intelligently, you can actually create an alternative source of legitimacy.
I have already got instructions. Only 2 questions we can take. One and Rajiv Kumar. Yeah, please.
My name is Sridhar Subramaniam. This is a question for you as a policy researcher. India is facing a population explosion. What are the deleterious consequences? The infrastructure is inadequate. Cities are bursting at their seams. It's more or less offset the fruits of development. Now, there is a new buzzword going around. There has been a failure of family planning in India. Now we go around and there is a buzzword, and we keep saying that we're going to reap the demographic dividend, which is an euphemism. Do you think, how do you react to this? What is your take on this?
We can have the next question, no? Rajiv Kumar.
Thanks, Pratap. Rajiv Kumar. You made this wonderful point about reforms are for the large corporate sector, if you like, reforms for the rich, and therefore they benefited them, and the lower middle class and the others feel excluded, and there's not the reform. And I think the way I had sort of seen it and put it yesterday was that the governance has been lacking. The governance reform has been lacking. That's the big deficit that we got. The question really is that how will this reforms of the governance or the reform for the poor, who will bring it forward? Who are the votaries for it? Which are the forces which will take it forward? Because the lower middle class aspires to get into the upper middle class, and the corporate sector tries to do whatever it can do to make up for the governance deficit. Which are the forces in the society which will push the government to undertake the reforms which will benefit and make this whole thing more participative and more inclusive? I can't see the I can't see the classes which will do that. One thought was that the bureaucracy could do it, because the bureaucracy is, has been the steel frame, but that seems to be now divided within its own, small coalitions fighting with each other. So what are your thoughts as to how this will come about?
The population question, so one short answer is frankly, most policies that don't address underlying causes, but rely on command and control systems will fail. So, the standard cliches, if you want population control, you get, reduced fertility rates, women's education and all of that. And that's beginning to have effect. What we were trying to do in the 70s by using the coercive power of the state, even under the best of circumstances, it's tricky. It was not going to work in India. And I think that larger developmental context, as the most effective way of producing population control is, the evidence on that is just so incontrovertible. And in a sense, this kind of literacy education figures are kind of bearing that out, and you're beginning to see those effects even in some of the poorer states. I think your question, it's a very big one. The way I think of social change leaders, and again, I think a bit of comparative perspectives helps. Most social change, I won't go, I mean, I won't sort of use appropriate Shankar's word about accidental. I think there is a ring to it. But there is certainly something conjunctural about it. It's never a question of, bureaucracy suddenly deciding we're going to do change or the middle class deciding going to do change. What's been happening, and that's partly why I was hinting at this framework, is lots of different things for other exogenous reasons start coming into place. And I think that's, in that sense, growth was a huge catalyst, right? Growth exogenously changed the scale story, right? Again, to take a example from a comparative context, because it does put the Indian story in light. If you think of, for example, Brazil's tackling of inequality, right? The real sort of turnaround in Brazil's Gini ratios, the appropriation of the anti-corruption movement, partly made possible by this extraordinary conjuncture of the rise of China, right? I mean, which allowed distribution without redistribution in a radical sense, right? So I think the interesting thing to watch is not, the mistake we should not make is like Marx thinking that there is some particular class that is the natural carrier of the destiny of history. I don't think you're going to get that. But is look at how these exogenous changes are putting in place a lot of these different elements which allow the possibilities of change.
So, thank you, Pratap, for such a brilliant talk. And you have really theorized a lot of realities that we see now in India. And in a personal note, I must say that I was struck with your this burden of democracy of 2003. I have to now update myself. There are a lot of things are happening and a lot of rethinking you have put now. And you have now mentioned about this tectonic shift. This is really very interesting concept you have brought. And with this, may I request you to give a big round of applause to Pratap.